People talk about belief in God as if it's the natural state of being, like it's obvious or built into the world, or something you arrive at just by being alive. But when you take a step back and really look at the idea, not emotionally, not out of habit, but just look at it clearly, it starts to feel much less certain, because the idea of God is at its core a claim about what exists, about what started the universe, about what watches, judges, listens, creates. And like any other claim about reality, it should be open to questions. What's the evidence? How do we know? Why should we believe it? That kind of questioning doesn't come from arrogance, it comes from curiosity. It comes from paying attention to the world as it is, not as we hope it might be. And when we do that, the idea of God doesn't become more convincing, it becomes harder to hold on to. Not because it offends reason, but because it avoids reason. It asks us to believe in something we can't see, can't test, and can't show to anyone else, and then calls that belief a virtue. If someone told you there was a person living on the other side of the moon, invisible, undetectable, watching everything you do, you'd probably ask for some kind of proof. And if they said you just have to have faith, or that this being reveals itself in feelings or sunsets or ancient books, you'd start to wonder if the idea is really about truth or just about comfort. That's where the conversation starts. Not with anger or certainty, just with the willingness to ask, what do we actually know? The most basic argument for God is that the universe had to come from somewhere, that something can't come from nothing. And at first glance, that feels like a strong point. Everything we see does seem to have a cause. Trees grow from seeds, people come from parents, rain falls from clouds. So why not say the universe comes from a creator? But when you look closer, that logic turns in on itself. If everything needs a cause, then what caused God? If God doesn't need a cause, then everything doesn't need a cause. You can't say the universe needs an explanation, but the explanation doesn't. That's not an answer. It's a way to stop asking questions. And the truth is, we don't fully know how the universe began. But not knowing is okay. Not knowing is honest. In science, it leads to deeper study. In religion, it's often replaced with a shortcut, a word, God. A label that feels like an answer but doesn't explain anything. Saying God did it doesn't describe how it happened, when, through what process, or what evidence shows that claim is true. It just fills a gap in understanding with an idea that can't be tested. And when you do that, when you put a label over what you don't know, you stop looking deeper. That's the real cost, not just the idea itself, but the way it shuts down inquiry, the way it turns mystery into dogma and curiosity into obedience. And for a long time, that was the default. People didn't have other tools. They couldn't model gravity or cell division or deep time. So they told stories, and those stories grew. They became traditions, then religions, then institutions, and over time, the stories became more important than the questions they were trying to answer. The symbols became more important than the search for truth. But now we live in a time where we can ask better questions, where we have tools that show us the age of the stars, the structure of atoms, the deep past of evolution, the origin of species, the depth of space. None of it needed a divine explanation. All of it came from looking, not believing. And what we find when we look isn't cold or empty. It's vast, connected, full of beauty and surprise. And it doesn't point to a creator. It points to complexity, randomness, laws of nature that don't require a mind behind them. Just cause, effect, time, and scale. That view doesn't shrink life. It grounds it. It lets us see ourselves as part of something real, not the center of a story written by a cosmic author. And that shift, from being watched to being aware changes everything. It changes how we see suffering. In many religious traditions, suffering is explained as a test, a punishment, or a mysterious part of some higher plan. But when you look at suffering without those filters, what you see is more straightforward. Pain happens because bodies break. Accidents happen. People make harmful choices. Nature is indifferent. No divine lesson is required for any of it. That doesn't make it meaningless. In fact, it makes compassion more urgent. If suffering isn't part of a plan, then it's up to us to reduce it, to help where we can, to prevent what's preventable. The less we blame invisible forces, the more clearly we can see what needs to be done in the real world. Some people say that morality proves the existence of God, that without a higher power we'd have no sense of right and wrong. But that idea doesn't match what we observe. People show empathy, kindness, and fairness across cultures, including those with no belief in gods. And people commit cruelty in the name of gods just as often. If morality came from a divine source, we'd expect it to be consistent, but it's not. Different religions teach different moral rules. Some condemn behavior that others celebrate. Some allow violence that others forbid. What we see instead is that morality evolves. It adapts, with knowledge, with experience, and with the growing understanding that other people matter. Evolutionary psychology offers a better explanation. Behaviors like cooperation, fairness, and empathy helped early humans survive. Groups that cared for one another did better than groups that didn't. Morality isn't a divine gift. It's a social tool, shaped by biology, culture, and shared experience. Another argument people use is personal experience. They say they feel God's presence, that they've had moments of connection or guidance. But personal feelings, no matter how strong, aren't proof of anything outside the mind. People from every religion and from no religion have powerful emotional experiences. Those feelings are real, but what they point to is open to interpretation. The human brain is built to find patterns, to feel connection, to respond emotionally. That's not a flaw, it's how we process the world. But it also means we're vulnerable to seeing meaning where there is none. A sunset doesn't need to be a sign. A coincidence doesn't need to be a message. A feeling of peace doesn't prove a presence. If those things proved anything, then every belief system would be equally valid. But they can't all be right, and if their only foundation is feeling, then none of them has more weight than the rest. That's why belief based on emotion, while deeply human, doesn't answer the question. It explains why someone believes, but not whether that belief is true. Another issue is how specific religions claim to know what God wants, what rules to follow, what texts to trust. But those claims are wildly different. Some say there are many gods. Others say just one. Some describe a God who is distant and abstract. Others picture a God who punishes wrongdoers and rewards loyalty. If there were one clear truth, why so many versions? Why so many contradictions? Why so many ancient books, each one calling itself the final word? The easiest explanation is that these ideas didn't come from a divine source. They came from people. People trying to make sense of their world, trying to guide behavior, trying to hold communities together, and sometimes trying to control. The use of religion to maintain power is not a side effect. It's built in. Throughout history, leaders have used divine authority to justify their rule, to suppress dissent, to shape laws. When a king says he rules by divine right, questioning him becomes more than rebellion, it becomes blasphemy. That kind of authority doesn't invite truth, it demands obedience. And that's where the idea of God becomes dangerous, not because belief itself is harmful, but because unquestioned belief can be used to justify almost anything. Wars, persecution, discrimination, denial of rights, all in the name of a higher will. If there's no way to test a claim, then there's no way to challenge it. And once that door is open, it stays open for every kind of abuse wrapped in the language of faith. But belief in God continues, not just because of tradition or fear, but because it offers something powerful. The feeling that you're not alone, that someone sees you, that your life has meaning beyond what you can see. These are deep human needs, and they matter. But needing something to be true doesn't make it true. People have needed many things throughout history: comfort, certainty, hope. But the world is not shaped around our needs. It is what it is. And sometimes, facing that directly is harder than believing a story, but it's also more honest and ultimately more freeing. When you begin to let go of the idea that someone is watching, rewarding, or punishing you from above, you start to see yourself and others more clearly. Responsibility shifts. Instead of waiting for a plan or a purpose to be revealed, you start making purpose yourself. You become responsible for your choices, your relationships, your impact. And that's not a loss, it's a kind of growing up. In that space, where belief used to sit, there's room for things that are real. Real questions, real uncertainty, real effort to understand the world through reason, through evidence, through empathy. It's slower than faith. It's less certain, but it's grounded. Some people argue that without God, life has no meaning, but that depends on what you think meaning is. If meaning comes from serving a creator, then yes, without that creator, the structure falls apart. But if meaning comes from connection, from love, from beauty, from creating something in the short time we have, then meaning is everywhere. Then meaning, and it's something we build. Every moment becomes more precious when you know it's not part of a larger plan. Every choice matters more when you know it's not being tallied for rewards later. Life becomes smaller in one way, but deeper in another. More fragile, more urgent, more honest. Belief in God has survived because it answers deep questions, but the answers are often too easy, too convenient. They explain everything, and in doing so explain nothing. When anything can be called God's will, nothing has to make sense. That's why people have used God to explain both health and sickness, both victory and defeat, both peace and disaster. But if a belief can explain any outcome, it predicts nothing. And if it predicts nothing, it doesn't help us understand reality. Contrast that with what we've learned through science. Disease was once blamed on sin or spirits. Now we understand viruses, bacteria, genetics. Lightning was once divine anger. Now it's understood as electric discharge in the atmosphere. These explanations don't remove wonder, they just remove error. They show that understanding doesn't require worship, it requires curiosity. And what we see over and over is that when we stop saying God did it, we start asking how things really work. And we get closer to the truth. That doesn't mean everything is answered. There are still mysteries, still questions about consciousness, time, the nature of reality. But saying we don't know is not the same as saying God must have done it. One invites further thought, the other shuts it down. When people say God explains consciousness or morality or beauty, they're not explaining those things, they're labeling them, turning wonder into certainty. But wonder doesn't need to be sealed off like that. It can stay open, alive. A question still worth exploring. Religious texts often contain poetry, stories, metaphors. Some of them are beautiful. Some carry emotional weight, but none of that means their claims about reality are true. Fiction can be powerful without being factual. Myths can hold meaning without being literal. That's not a weakness, it's part of what makes stories human. But when myth becomes law, when poetry becomes doctrine, when metaphor is treated as fact, we lose the ability to distinguish what's meaningful from what's verifiable. And that's where real harm begins. Because when belief is treated as knowledge, it starts making decisions about education, medicine, policy, rights. It shapes lives based on things that can't be tested or confirmed. That's not a private choice. That's a public consequence. And it's why asking whether God exists isn't just philosophy, it's practical. The more we build systems based on belief without evidence, the more we risk making decisions that don't line up with reality. And the more we live according to ideas that can't be challenged, the more power we give to those who claim to speak for the divine. That's not a future that encourages growth, it's one that freezes it. But it doesn't have to be that way. People can and do live good lives without belief in God. They raise children, they love deeply, they help others, they create. They face grief and joy and loss without appealing to anything supernatural, and they find meaning not in being told what to believe, but in discovering what's true. And that discovery, slow, imperfect, sometimes difficult, is one of the most honest things a person can do. It means looking at life without a safety net. It means admitting that we don't have all the answers and we might never have them. But that doesn't stop us from asking. It doesn't stop us from caring, building, hoping. In fact, it makes those things more urgent, more real. When you stop believing that someone else has a plan for you, you begin to take more ownership of your life. Your choices matter because you're the one making them, not because someone is keeping score, but because they affect the world around you. Morality without God isn't just possible, it's personal. It comes from empathy, from understanding, from living in a shared world. It doesn't need divine rules written in stone. It just needs attention to the impact of our actions. And what we find across countries, cultures, and centuries is that people can work together to build ethical systems. They can change those systems when they fail. They can agree to protect rights, reduce harm, and increase fairness without referring to anything supernatural. This isn't a theory, it's already happening. Many of the most peaceful, equal, and well-functioning societies in the world today are also among the least religious, not because they lack morality, but because they've found other ways to guide it. And that's the key difference. Morality grounded in religion often depends on authority. Obey because it's written, because it was spoken, because it was commanded. Morality grounded in reason asks a different question. What reduces suffering? What builds trust? What helps people live better lives? Those questions don't need a God, they just need a willingness to think clearly, feel deeply, and act responsibly. One of the hardest things about letting go of the idea of God is losing the comfort it offers. The idea that someone is looking out for you, that everything happens for a reason, that pain has a purpose, that death is not the end. These ideas are soothing, but that's also what makes them hard to examine honestly. Because the truth is, sometimes things don't happen for a reason. Sometimes good people suffer and die, and no lesson comes from it. Sometimes there is no deeper message, just pain and healing and what we do next. That kind of honesty can be difficult, but it can also be freeing. It means we can stop trying to explain tragedy with stories that don't fit. We can stop blaming people for their own misfortune. We can stop waiting for justice from beyond and start working for it here, in the world we actually live in. Death, too, takes on a different meaning. When you no longer believe in an afterlife, you don't stop caring, you care more. Life becomes precious not because it's eternal, but because it's limited. Every hour, every relationship, every choice matters more when you know it won't last forever. And grief becomes something else, too. It's no longer softened by the hope of reunion, but it becomes more honest. We grieve because we loved, and we remember because memory is all we have, and sometimes that's enough. Some people hear all of this and still say, but I feel like there must be something more. And that's understandable. We are pattern-seeking, story-loving creatures. We look for meaning, we crave connection. It's built into us. But that feeling, that longing for more, doesn't prove anything. It just proves we're human. It's okay to want meaning. It's okay to look for beauty, but it's also okay to accept that the world is what it is, even if it's not what we hoped. Because what we have is still enough. We have each other. We have a vast, ancient universe to explore. We have minds that can think, hands that can build, hearts that can care. We don't need to be created in someone else's image to find value in who we are. And we don't need a God to be good. We just need to be honest, with ourselves, with others, with the world as it is. Not as we wish it were, but as it really is. And in that honesty, there's strength. The kind of strength that doesn't come from certainty, but from awareness. The strength to live with questions, to accept limits, to care anyway. To get up each day knowing that this life, with all its complexity, its chaos, its beauty and loss, is all we know we have. And that's enough reason to make it matter. The idea of God has lasted for thousands of years, not because it's supported by evidence, but because it speaks to something deep inside us. The need to belong, the fear of death, the longing for justice, the comfort of being watched by something larger than ourselves. But we now have the tools to look past those stories, to explore not just what we feel, but what we can know, not to destroy meaning, but to rebuild it in ways that are grounded, shared, and honest. Rejecting the idea of God isn't rejecting wonder, it's stepping into a deeper kind of wonder, one that doesn't need invisible beings or ancient books. One that comes from seeing things as they are, vast, unpredictable, sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful. The sky doesn't need a creator to be beautiful. A newborn baby doesn't need a soul to be cherished. Music, love, memory, kindness, they don't need to be part of a plan to be profound. They are enough on their own. And maybe the most meaningful thing we can do is live as though this life is the only one we get. Because when you stop waiting for a next life, you start living more fully in this one. You listen more carefully. You love more fiercely. You take responsibility, not because someone is watching, but because you are here, now, and what you do matters. Not forever, but today. And that is more than enough reason to care.